thanks already to a number of people in the audience for making me feel very welcoming in Cambridge today. And I've had a very good day with some campaigning, a good visit to a sixth form college with Daniel, an enjoyable meal, and also a meeting with some colleagues from the Wolf Institute that I've known over the years, talking about politics and faith and other issues. I should start, I suppose, and I'll try and be relatively brief tonight to allow time for discussion. We've got a good size discussion group to get a good discussion going. I should apologise to anybody who came for some of the earlier discussion, which was advertised as How Left is Labour, which got advertised before anybody asked me if that's what I wanted to talk about. And the reason that I said no is because you actually then have to spend half an hour defining what is left before you can decide where Labour is on that spectrum. And this is really brought home to me the other day. As you know, we've got a special conference on Saturday about changing the union link. And as part of the preparation for that, I was asked by the party's social media team to go and be filmed having talks with various constituents in a hovercraft factory in Southampton about the Labour Party and politics and everything else. And one of those interviews was actually done by Rowena Davies, who's going to be my successor in the Southampton seat. And she was actually talking to somebody who was a very committed supporter of the Labour Party. And Rowena said, do you have any worries about the Labour Party? And she said, well, I think it's much too left-wing. And Rhoda said, well, what do you mean? She said, well, I think the Labour Party should be sorting out the banks and getting all of those private companies out of the health service. It shouldn't be doing left-wing things like telling people they can't smoke in their cars. Now, obviously, the Fabian Society, which embodies the principles of that top-down paternalistic statism, is entirely in favour of forbidding people to do various things in their own good. So that won't go down very well. So it just shows that actually people do not work in a set frame of reference, let alone the ones you might have had in the 1970s. It's, how much of the economy is run by the state or run by cooperatives or whatever. So let's talk instead about, not about where we are on some arbitrary scale, but where is Labour going and what will be the hallmarks of the Ed Miliband government that we'll have after the next election. Because I'm very well aware, and we talked about this earlier over dinner, that there's quite a widespread perception that it's still not that clear what a Miliband government will look like, that it was all slightly being developed as we go along and made up along the way. And I really want to counter that idea tonight and to suggest that what we're seeing from Ed Miliband is a much clearer and much more strategic view about what he's trying to achieve with the Labour Party and in British politics than is generally the view, certainly, of the commentariat in the media at the moment. He gave a Hugo Young lecture a few weeks ago, and he started quite provocatively by talking about Margaret Thatcher and Margaret Thatcher's division of people in government into whether you are one of us or not one of us. And he did that not to praise Margaret Thatcher, but to make a simple political point. You won't succeed in government unless you know what it is you want to achieve. And yes, you're very clear about your sense of direction, because there are tens of thousands of decisions taken in government every single year. And you can't be at the centre of it, taking all of those 10,000s of decisions. So the only way it works is if the whole machine and your colleagues in politics know where you're going. So that's sort of the hallmark, I think, not really of a politician who's making it up as they go along. You don't stand up and make the strength of your conviction, the clarity of your purpose, the test of your government if you don't really know what you want to do. And I'd suggest, of course I will do this because cards on the table, I was one of the people who were in the cabinet in the last government. I was one of the first people to endorse Ed Miliband. I'm a friend of his. I was his PPS until not long ago. So you'd expect me to say this, but Ed, I think, has always known where he wanted to go and where he wanted to take the Labour Party. Not in every detail, and it's also true that sometimes events and opportunities define the pace of change. I don't think that he was ever happy with the structure of newspaper ownership and the relationship between newspapers and the media and politics, but it was the circumstances that led to the attack on the Murdoch press about phone hacking when they happened. Similarly, I think he's always had a sense of where he wants to be on the relationship between the Labour Party and members of trade unions and their involvement in the Labour Party. It was events that perhaps mean that we are where we are for this weekend you might not have expected a year ago. Indeed, even on climate change, something to which he's been personally committed as an issue for many years. He's a politician that sometimes sees the opportunity, as with the floods, to push an issue up the political agenda, which had been perceived as being very difficult, and in fact not the sort of thing you should talk about, it's not where the voters are. So I want to try and do an overview, and I want to, I think this is probably the wrong audience to say this, but to address something that was said to me by one of my party members a few weeks ago, which was someone was complaining about the Labour Party not having politics and policy, and she didn't know what we stood for. And I was listing in a particular topic that she had talked about a whole area of policy. And she said, well, I didn't know about that. And then she said, you see, John, if it's not in The Guardian and it's not on the BBC 10 o'clock news, it hasn't happened. So there is a difficulty that some people do assess the Labour Party purely through what they read in a newspaper that didn't even support us at the last election, and what's on the 10 o'clock news, where unfortunately we don't actually have a franchise to get as much coverage as we would like. And the reason I said I'd talk about this tonight is that those of you who are members of the Fabian Society may recall that just about 2 years ago the Fabians published a book which I edited called The Shape of Things to Come, tongue-in-cheek, following the words of one of our most famous eugenicists in the Fabian Society, but nonetheless, what we did was I assembled a group of people from quite diverse backgrounds and different politics within the Labour Party, and I said, have a look at what Ed Miliband has said. Look what he said during the leadership campaign. Look at what he said in the first 6 months as leader. His value statements, his general sense of direction, and tried to see where this would lead. This wasn't a hack job on behalf of Ed's office. They didn't see the text until it was ready to go to the press. And it was a possibility rather than a prediction, if you like. But the interesting thing 2 years later is to see how much of what people were anticipating on the basis of Ed's value statements and his politics have actually come about. I mean, firstly, the assessment of the nature of the sort of problems we faced in Britain. I mean, Ed, like many people, believes that we did a lot of good things in government. But probably more clearly than many other people, and we had great candidates for leadership, he understood why some of the things that we had done in government had failed, and that some of the things we had done in government would not work in the world we now faced in the future. And particularly that was the assessment of the state of our economy following the global banking crisis. The global banking crisis was not caused by the failures of a British Labour government, and we can debate that afterwards if anyone wants to argue that it was, but it wasn't. But it revealed a number of things. The first was that we are far too dependent on the financial sector. But the second thing, when you look back at it, was that some of the problems which have rushed to the fore since, which was shrinking wages, a growth in low productivity jobs, too little investment in the most essential and competitive parts of the economy, weren't caused by the global banking crisis. And what Ed understood and said, and had said during his leadership campaign, these were becoming apparent several years before the global banking crisis. And so the model that we had, which was essentially you could get the economy to work, and then you could by a free market economy, and then to look at the problems of low income, of poverty, of social exclusion by tax-based redistribution, actually had already run its course. And that if you actually wanted to deal with problems of inequality, and you actually wanted to deal with problems of low pay and poor jobs, you had to move to a much more profound challenge to the neoliberal model that had been broadly expected. And that meant saying that you weren't going to be successful in these areas unless work itself delivered better incomes, and not just the ability to supplement poor pay through tax credits and redistribution. Ed, subsequent to the, or before this book, had talked about responsible capitalism, and in the essays that the Fabians published, it was a recognition that the remodelling of the economy was essential to delivering the sort of outcomes that we wanted. So one part of what was already predictable from what Ed Miliband had said 2 years ago was this emphasis on trying to restructure and reshape the British economy so that it itself delivered fairer outcomes for people. The second theme that came through a lot of the essays, which is quite interesting just over the last few weeks, was a recognition that we were inevitably going to face tight public spending and there wasn't going to be money to spend. It was actually less obvious 2 years ago that Osborne would fail quite so spectacularly to deal with the debt problem. I think even we thought he might have made some better progress and not still be as far away from a solution as he was 5 years ago. But nonetheless, our authors thought that a Labour government would be facing public spending cuts rather than public spending increases. And people thought, well, in an era of tight public spending, the sort of models of public service delivery that we had had in government, which were a sort of mixture of centralised targets and markets, both intended to produce higher productivity in public services, wasn't going to work any longer. We had pushed those as far as they could go. The authors of the Fabian book 2 years ago said, based again on things that Ed had broadly talked about, was the future was going to be quite different. It was going to have to be much more decentralised. You were going to have to move away from the silos of public spending so that budgets were pooled at local level, and you were going to need a different relationship between users and deliverers of public services and the sort of accountability you had for it at local level. The reason I say that's quite interesting because this was being written by people who were thinking about public services 2 years ago, and very little has been said about public services until the last month. But actually that set of ideas is at the core of the arguments that John Cruddas and Ed Miliband put forward 2 weeks ago. So it is a sense that it is going to be possible to deliver better public services if we measure that by outcomes for people, despite really tight spending restrictions, provided we are bold enough to devolve responsibility for spending that money and breaking down the silos, for example, as Andy Burnham's been talking about, between health and social care, which bring huge inefficiencies and huge inflexibilities into the system as well. And the third strand that people picked on, so your economic reform, a different approach to public services, the third strand that people picked up on was the sense that New Labour in government had become very technocratic, very insensitive to people, to the places and to the communities that they lived in. And so it anticipated a greater willingness to talk about the fact that migration is not an uncomplicated issue, particularly in areas where populations change very fast, or there's a perception that the competition is in the poorest areas of the workforce, that people did worry about having betting shops all the way down the high street, that they didn't want the pubs turned into Tesco's without there being any controls over it. And so the third strand that people came up with was that they thought that Ed would take the Labour Party towards a much more personal, people or community-centred view of the world. And that indeed I think you can see in many ways, including in immigration policy and in planning policy, he's been prepared to do. What came across very clearly in this document was that these were interlinked. That there wasn't a separate debate over here about the economy, one about public services, one about the nature of the communities we lived in. That change in each area depended on a coherent and radical programme, not piecemeal reform. So, for example, if you wanted a social security system that rewarded work and contribution, because it was very clear that people felt our social welfare system, social security system doesn't do that, to move us back towards full employment, then you would actually have to re-emphasise childcare and making childcare more affordable. Because actually, if you want to reduce the costs of unemployment, to boost family incomes, childcare has got to be more affordable, and there have been moves in that direction. There was an understanding that you could promote living wages to raise incomes, but actually that wouldn't be enough unless you had a wholesale assault on the cartels and market abuse that we see in our economy. And we've seen that in the last 6 months through the attack on the energy companies and the call for the fuel price freeze, but only as a staging point to reform of energy markets. So this idea that there are three linked changes coming together has, I think, which was identified by our group of authors 2 years ago from things that Ed had already said, have, I think, increasingly come to the fore as the policy process has gone on. He hadn't at that stage put the wrapper of one nation around the way of expressing these ideas, but he's done that since. So, I would argue to you, at least tonight, that what we've been seeing coming out of Ed Miliband and the policy team is not something surprising or unexpected, but something that could have been predicted by looking at what he said historically and as leader of the Labour Party. The question, I think, now for us politically is, what can we now achieve in the next year to consolidate that vision that Ed has been unrolling? It is actually an extraordinary position. I think the polls go up and down, but today we're on 40%. We've been sort of 38, 37, 39, 40. Most people thought at the time of the last general election that it would be really impossible to contemplate a majority Labour government after one term of opposition. So it's a significant achievement that we've got to where we are at the moment, where we are more likely than any other party to be the majority party at the next election. Doesn't mean we will be, but we're more likely to be than any other party. And that is significant not just because we have recovered better than you might have expected a party to do after such an appalling electoral victory for the Tories and an appalling defeat for us, but also because the political world that we are living in is shown by all the decent and sensitive polling to be much more difficult today to pull a majority together. The centre ground, which was a genuine and real phenomenon for New Labour during the 1990s and the 1997 election, there was a whole cluster of voters in the centre ground, has hollowed out. Voters have polarised significantly over the last 10 years. So people who used to be socially conservative are more socially conservative. People who are up for radical change, who tend to be the people you meet in Labour Party meetings, have become more up for radical change. People whose main focus is their own aspirations and prospect for success are both focused on that, but much less secure about their ability to achieve it at the moment. So actually pulling together an electoral coalition for the Labour Party is much harder than it was 20 years ago, because the groups of voters that we have to reach are further apart from people at the moment. So put that into the mix as well, then we have done, I think, surprisingly well to be where we are at the moment. Question, I guess, or the challenge for us, for all of us over the next year, is to take it to the stage where we can take the potential we've got at the moment and consolidate it. And I'd suggest there are probably 3 or 4 key challenges there. I talked about three strands of Ed's thinking which have been crucial here. One has been the reshaping of the economy. The second has been a very different approach to public services. And third has been a different sensitivity to communities and how people feel about the world about them. And I think the challenge for all of us now is to make that really come together for a vision of a different sort of society. So if you take the economy, the challenge for this year is to go beyond talking about freezing fuel prices to what lies behind it, which is a different approach to tackling market abuse, to allowing new companies to enter, to making markets work effectively at bringing down prices. It means taking a different approach to investment, where We spell out how the changes to financial regulation, the changes to banking, the changes to infrastructure investment genuinely create a country in which businesses can have the confidence to invest for the long term. It's actually making it sound as though it is definitely plausible to do more to capitalise on the sort of fantastic research you have in not just Cambridge University but many others, to drive a much bigger section of innovative business than we do at the moment. So I think, having got the ear of the public when we talk about a cost of living crisis, which is about getting into a conversation with people, it's now about saying we have got the ability to change the way in which the economy operates so that people actually feel that these people don't just know we're badly off, but might plausibly be able to do something about it in the longer term. I think in terms of reshaping public services, where in public policy terms that debate has opened up only quite recently. There are key issues, for example, bringing together health and social care, where we've got to make these come alive to people. And people say, yes, I can see how that will happen. Well, actually, we live in a country where most families have had somebody go through the care system and be in and out of hospital. It shouldn't be too difficult to persuade people there's a different way of running these things that would have been better, simpler, if not cheaper, actually more cost effective. And similarly, there are areas which is clearly a major issue for us politically, like welfare spending, where we've got to drive home the fact that we actually think that young people should have to take a job after a year, publicly funded job, rather than be on the dole for a long term. That would actually save money from the benefits bill and is the right thing to do socially. We need to drive home much more clearly than we've yet got across that if you really want to tackle the housing benefits bill, you've got to tackle aspiring private sector housing rents, which are driving up the housing benefit bill. We need to make the argument that not only is childcare probably the dominant issue for the vast majority of families with young people economically, even more than the cost of housing at the moment, but that also is a way of raising family incomes by making it possible for... I was in Brighton a couple of weeks ago canvassing, and I actually met 3 couples in the one morning where one partner was not working because of the cost of childcare made it unviable. And cheap childcare would unlock a huge increase in their family incomes, and that of course is exactly what Lucy Powell has been talking about. So, my summary to you, and I'll stop at this point and provoke a discussion I hope, is that far from this being a sort of work in progress, making it up as we go along process that we're seeing from Ed Miliband, what we are seeing in policy terms not only was predictable, but was predicted by the Fabians a couple of years ago, not in every detail, but in broad sense of direction, that this has put us in a position where we can win the next general election. But there's a task for all of us over the next year to do what we can to help flesh it out and make it real in every town and city and village in the country. Thank you for listening. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, John. We've got lots of strands to work through there. All right, let's have some debate. Who wants to kick off?
I'll get the early train then.
Go on, Daniel. You've got something to say.
I've always got something to say. You get to meet John, one thing that some of the students at Long Road this afternoon were raising with us was how we convince people, how we bring back the trust in politics. Some of the things that I think you've been talking about could do that, but I think it's got to go a stage further. How do you think we can? I'm not convinced we can do it in a year, but I think we've got to make some inroads on that. Because at the moment, what I'm hearing from so many people is we don't much like the current government, but we don't actually think that much of you either. And that's part, I think, of the political problem we've got.
No, that's true, and there's a deep loss of faith in politics and the political process and politicians in general. We have very specifics in this country, the expenses scandal and things of that sort, but actually this is pretty much a common, consistent Western problem. Pretty much every country has a UKIP, sometimes much nastier than ours, sometimes not quite as stupid as ours, but their sort of populist right of centre rejectionism of the traditional parties is there in many countries. As we all know, Euroscepticism is by no means confined to Britain, and so those are real issues. So what can we practically do in the short term? Well, one is that the campaigning side of the party, particularly but not exclusively the sort of community organising and campaigning side of stuff, is actually crucial. I mean, people do not reject politicians they know. Right? You come to my constituency, they will exclude me from the politicians they don't like. And actually in Cambridge here, they exclude Julian from the politician they like. They might not like him being a Liberal Democrat, but he's not. They draw a distinction between politicians they know and politicians they don't know. So the biggest and simplest thing we can actually do in the last year is be on more people's doorsteps, talking to more people about more issues. So there's a person that represents the Labour Party, not just somebody on television. And it's coming back to the, if we're relying on the Guardian and the 10 o'clock news, this is not going to reach a large section of the electorate, and it's more personal if you're on the doorstep. So that work that you're doing here in other parts of the country is critical. The second thing I think we've got to do is that, I've been slightly sort of arrogant tonight, so I say, well, we knew what was happening, even if you lot didn't, which is the way it comes across. We wrote this book about it. But my point is that lots of people in the Labour movement are probably only now catching up to what the story is, right, about where it's going. Because if you weren't following every detail and nuance, the idea that there was this coherent picture is probably a relatively new revelation, and not everybody's got it yet. So it is really important that we understand what we expect our government to do. Because when we talk about devolving, for example, much more responsibility for public spending to local cities, councils, city regions, whatever the appropriate structure is, when we actually say that we believe, which I think will emerge, that when you're trying to get people back into work who've been out of work for a long time, that is probably better run by a local service rather than an Atos contract where people can distinguish different types of labour markets. Now, what does that actually mean? That means in each of these areas there have got to be people who are prepared to stand up to that challenge. People are able to run those services. People who've got the political will to be involved in them. There's not some sort of stage army of civil servants who are suddenly going to turn up and do this stuff. So we as a party at local level need to be equipped to deliver what's needed in a way that not everybody's realised at the moment. Now, I'm constantly impressed by people I meet who are running councils at the moment. And I've said this to you earlier. My councillors in Southampton have got a much better idea how you try to deliver decent services with less money than some people who might find themselves being ministers. I shouldn't say that, so this is being recorded, but I mean, not everybody's got their they are facing a loss of 30% of their budget. So they are seriously thinking about what do you do with 30% less money, and how do you protect priorities, and how do you do things differently. So I'm relatively optimistic about the local end of things, because I think Labour local government in many ways has really got its head around these challenges in a way that central people haven't had a chance to do. But so the second thing we have to do is we have to make a success of this in government. That if we think we're going to go into government, and actually as party members we sit back and do our sort of dancing on ice, how many marks out of 10 do we give the government, which is the way we tended to look at governments in the past, instead of thinking we are actually going to need to be part of the delivery of what the government does in practice, we will soon run into difficulty. So part of our challenge is preparing ourselves as a party. Now, I think the work that Arne Graff's been doing on community organising and those sorts of things is actually developing a very different type of Labour Party member in many parts of the country, and is liberating some people who've always wanted to do this and didn't seem to be part of the normal way of working. So that's an investment in it. Yeah.
Two questions. The first one is, you mentioned that Labour's ultimate, I suppose, foundation of the manifesto will likely be devolving power to local levels and giving power to people.
Yeah.
How is that different from the Conservatives or the Liberal Democrats manifesto of 2010? they also pledged to do exactly the same thing.
Yeah.
And we saw the Localism Act, which was introduced in 2011, and we have Eric Pickles, who seems to be very much on the ball in this arena, or at least that's the perception of many people.
Right.
But there seems to be a general consensus among political parties that we all agree that localism and devolving power from central government is the way forward. And secondly, are Labour not just ultimately giving the responsibility to evenly spread the cuts to local authorities instead of giving that responsibility to central governments? They're just transferring that responsibility ultimately. Is it not just a way out? Difficult decisions.
It's a very interesting question, because you frame it in terms of the manifesto, and I'd have to go and look back at the word of the manifesto. My recollection is of what or certainly in the coalition agreement, was much more radical and decentralist than what was actually done. Yeah. That's the truth of it. And there is, in a sense, a sort of pressure of history towards what I'm talking about doing, because there is no other way of delivering better public services with the money we've got than the trust to have a greater level of devolution. I was responsible in government, in the last year of Labour government, for a programme called Total Place, which is a series of pilot projects looking at actually doing this very, very effectively. And I had a very good relationship with Liam Byrne, who's the Chief Secretary of the Treasury, which you have to have the Treasury committed to doing this sort of thing. And actually what many of us thought the coalition should do was take that programme and run with it. What they actually did was they talked the language, but then health went off in a completely different direction. So you take health out of pooling money at local level, you've taken a huge chunk out of it. Education went off with free schools and God knows what else in another completely different direction. The police went off with police commissioners. So actually what you ended up with was very little of they have a sort of last vestiges of pooling of budgets, but it's absolutely tiny. And we were talking today at Long Road Sixth Form College, and I was giving an example of South Hampshire where the LEP has been devolved money to invest in sort of 16 to 18 provision, but because of the way it's been done, they do not have the discretion to put it in sixth form colleges rather than FE colleges. Well, this is not localism. And in Hampshire, you need the money in the sixth form colleges, not the FE colleges. So actually the rhetoric has been hugely impressive and the delivery has been hugely disappointing. Now, one of the reasons that I think we need to, in the Labour Party, be very clear about this is there were all sorts of conservative elements in government, I mean small c conservative element, who will fight to get back against all of this. They will, because they were there when we were trying to do the Total Place project. So getting a real understanding of what we expect people to do is crucially important. And we spent a lot of time in government, firstly centralising, then setting lots of targets, and then evolving a very complex relationship with local authorities through local area agreements and multi-area agreements to try and have a different sort of relationship with central government. It was quite late in the day that enough people made the sort of intellectual breakthrough. You had to go much further than that. And, in many ways, history could have been different. The coalition could have lifted the papers that Liam Byrne and John Denham left in the drawer and made something of them, but they didn't. So it falls to us to go back and do it properly. Yeah.
You say that we should listen to the various readings and musings of Ed Miliband, and if we'd all done that, we would have some idea of what will happen, and we'll have no surprise. But actually, it seems to me that we as potential supporters or voters shouldn't have to indulge in this kind of Kremlinology. It sounds like kite flying. He came out and said, I believe in this. I'm for faith schools or not, I'm for nationalising railways or not, I'm for bankers' bonuses or not. Come with some hard policies and views. It would be rather easier. I don't think it's fair to expect supporters to actually read through all his talkings and sayings and come to their own opinion. And maybe they might be right, maybe not. Local power, I was going to ask about the previous question I asked about it, but historically people have passed authority to local authorities so that it doesn't look like national government's fault, but they haven't willed the means. They've capped council tax and they've forced someone else to make the bad decisions. Localism works really well in Switzerland, where I worked and lived for 6 years. It works very well at the federal level and the communal level. The Swiss Federation, Swiss cantons and the Swiss communes have the power to raise tax. They're not capped by local government. If you do that, it'll work marvellously. And I want to ask you something about specific, which is PFI, which is a particular bugbear of mine, as some of you here may know. I regard regard it as being electoral catnip. It's marvellous. You get a shiny new hospital, you get elected next time you build a new hospital, or whatever it might be. 30 years later, children and grandchildren are still paying outrageous prices for this. The chickens are coming home to roost fairly soon. Are you for or against?
For or against?
PFI.
Yeah.
As a way of funding, hospitals, trains, whatever else.
Okay. Right, there's quite a lot of questions right. So on your first point, actually, one of the very interesting things is there's far more Labour policy now than there was before the 97 election. Okay, there may not be a policy on absolutely everything, but there's really quite a lot of Labour policy at the moment. And I wasn't really suggesting that everybody had to have read through the various documents and all the rest of it. The detailed policy that you put forward has a number of considerations. One is there's perfectly sufficient policy to justify everything I've said tonight without needing to be a criminologist. Some things will be held back from manifesto, some things will be announced ahead of the election, some things will be properly subject to review in government. That's inevitably the way that things are. But I think that there is where we are, and everything is partly framed by the timing of the run-up to an election. Okay, what I would say to you now is I think there is a coherent story here about the way that Britain needs to change that will increasingly be fleshed out. And the crucial point, abundantly, is maximising the vote when the election comes, not the year before or 2 years before. And that's what the process is about. In terms of localism, it's quite interesting. I mean, objectively, there is no commitment in the Labour Party to new local tax raising powers. As an observer of the scene, I think that debate will grow. It's been raised by the leader of Manchester Council. It's been raised by the Mayor of London. If you move in English politics towards a much greater level of devolution to city regions primarily, and if wherever we are after the referendum, this is a live debate for Wales and Scotland, I can absolutely see that being on the political agenda over the next 10 years. I mean, it's not the Labour Party policy, but it seems to me there is some logic that goes with that. The thing I'd say is it has to be coherent across the United Kingdom as a whole. It can't be done in a wholly piecemeal fashion, but that's one possibility. On PFI, I mean, I'm not against PFI, and I think the reality was that PFI did enable us to get hospitals in place now, which otherwise we would have had to wait for 30 years for. So,
taxes.
Pardon?
Or raise taxes.
Or raise taxes, yes, that's true. And I think that governments always have to make judgments about what they can win support for. Okay? I mean, the idea that every government can simply solve every problem by raising taxes and get re-elected is not true. And so there's always a judgment to be made about what you can do. The real problem with PFI was the way in which there wasn't sufficient expertise in the system to do it effectively. So it's not the PFI decisions, the PFI principle is bad, but as you see with some of the refinancing and all the rest of it that's going on, they were bad deals. They were constructed poorly, the negotiations were done badly, and I had some exposure to this when I was at the Department of Health, and I used to sort of say, if every chief executive did 2 PFI schemes, the second one would be really good. But the trouble is every chief executive only ever did 1. And by the time they worked out it wasn't really very good, the costs were in the system. So I'm not against it in principle, but it wasn't well done.
But it never can be by the so they'll always be outspent on legal advice by the corporation.
No, I think actually if you had sufficient central one of the things I fought battles over, but for about 18 months, one of the things was there was no central expertise on the delivery of health service PFI schemes during the time that many PFI schemes were being developed. So each hospital chief executive, local health structure was doing this for themselves against a set of providers who were astonishingly well organised. Now, that was not inevitable. The balance could have been done differently at the centre of government. But one day I'll write a story about why that didn't happen. I'll let you carry on. Jerry.
Sorry,
you can ask, yeah.
Yeah. Oh, right, yeah. Well, can I ask you a direct question and then make a comment which I'd like you to comment on? I'm very interested to know, I thought that Miliband was very good when he took on Murdoch.
Yeah.
That was a very important statement he made there, and an important break with Labour Party's past handling of its media relations. But I wonder, this is the direct question, how you think a future Labour government would act in the present circumstances following the Leveson report and the challenge to that report by the big guns in the media. That's my question.
Okay.
My comment is, I've joined up the dots, I think, with the various statements that Ed Miliband has made, but I don't think the average person going around canvassing for the Labour Party has any coherent idea. And if there were just a very principled A4 page that people could actually have at their beck and call, because I've gone canvassing with people who say absurd things. I mean, to be frank,
Yeah.
honest about it, really absurd things and not very helpful. So, but I want to go a bit beyond that too, because I think Labour's current position, I understand the need for discipline and for some kind of self-discipline, but when you, I don't know how many times I've cringed listening to the radio or watching Question Time when a Labour person has not been able to be frank, straightforward and so on, and they duck and weave for all the difficult questions. And of course that's the job of the interviewers, to give them difficult questions, and there must be a way in which the Labour Party could have a coherent overall policy coherence, and also allow people on Question Time, for example, to give an honest answer to questions, and a personal answer, without saying, I'm going to commit the Labour Party to this or that. But in my view, this is the right thing to do. And I think the party would gain enormously if it was seen as, instead of a kind of brain-dead collection of people who dare not speak their mind, that idea was replaced by all these intelligent people saying this, that and the other within a general framework. For example, someone on housing the other day was asked about high rents and private renting. Why couldn't that person have said, we think probably rent controls are necessary, or something like that? Because clearly it's being thought about in the Labour Party, and unless people are allowed to say what they think, you just don't give the impression of a party that's bursting with energy and ideas and ability. You give an impression of a party that's dead scared of ever saying what it really thinks about anything.
Right. Okay. Let's. One of the great difficulties, and look, everybody recognises the point that you make. Okay, it's not like everybody thinks they're saying, what a stupid comment, how dare you make that observation. Everybody recognises this. The difficulty in practice is actually doing that in a way that doesn't create far more problems. Now, some people are better at this than others. I mean, that will be the nature of the game. I'll give you a good example a few weeks ago. IPPR, which is not even the Labour Party, produced a report on youth unemployment, which actually was fleshing out the ideas that Labour has already put, that after 12 months people should be required to take a job, okay, and be publicly funded. And they'd set out some of the detail about how that could be done. It was interpreted wrongly as removing benefits from young people. Okay. A storm blew up about that, because then the media rang up various people who felt they should speak freely to say they didn't agree with this policy of removing benefits from young people. And so within 48 hours, the Labour Party had been forced to trash the entire report, even though it is actually in itself an entirely sensible report. Now, it's the same for front benchers. Let me give you an example. I come from southern England. Our shipyard is being shut so that orders go to the Clyde. I would love to say if I was a front bencher, I can say this now because I'm not a front bencher, I think we should make it absolutely clear that if they vote for independence, there will never be another ship built in Scotland for Labour. Right. However, I'm advised by my colleagues north of the border that these are unhelpful comments to make in the context of a Scottish referendum. Now, I would have given you a perfectly honest answer that you would have enjoyed, and actually most of my constituents would have thought was absolutely wonderful. It might have had unfortunate political consequences in a referendum campaign that my colleagues are trying to win. So it just is. It is. I completely understand, and everybody completely understands what you say, but it is not quite as simple as that. Particularly, most of the people you see on television. I have the luxury now. I'm not standing at the next election. I'm not on the front bench. I'm not Ed Miliband's PPS. I'm totally deniable. But most of these people are potentially going to be ministers in the jobs that they've got. So what they say take rent controls. I have absolutely no doubt there are people looking very seriously at a major problem, which is that if private rents continue to spiral, we have a massive problem with the housing benefit bill. There are different strategies for bringing it down, and I have no doubt that one of those is rent controls. But to go out before the work has been done, to say that's what our policy is going to be, or a front bencher saying, I think we need it to be rent controls, you're actually for a start, you're less likely to ever get rent controls. Because you fall into a debate. There's no policy to back it up. No one can say how it works. There are respectable, sensible economists to say that you can't dismiss the effect on housing supply of having rent control, whether they're right or not. Because emotionally, one thing. So you can't just say to people, free up. Now, we need a way of enabling people to find a different way of, if you like, sounding more relaxed on these issues. But simply letting everybody say lots of different things just leads to huge stories about splits.
Well, I think the deniability thing is pretty straightforward, really. I mean, if someone says on their own bat, this is what my view is, I don't know, without committing the party.
You can't do that.
Why not?
Because if you're, partly there's collective responsibility, but if you're a minister and you say, look, I may be the shadow minister for housing, and I think we should have rent controls, but don't worry, when we're in government we might not, and I'll be perfectly happy not implementing rent controls. So it's just not possible. Or if you're not the shadow minister of housing, you're the shadow minister of transport, and you think, I think my colleagues should have rent controls. The next day the shadow housing minister is on the Today programme saying, your colleagues are saying you should have rent controls. So you've got to go in there and say, my colleague did not know what they were talking about. This does not help the Labour Party win elections.
Well,
anyway,
the general impression is, I think, very, very damaging to the party.
Well,
and I don't quite buy your response, but
it always was in the 1990s, Stuart. I mean, people said exactly the same things when I was a young MP in the run-up to the 1997 election. We were much more disciplined than we were then, than we are now, and we've got a majority of 140. It wasn't because we all said the same things on the television.
Okay.
And we did.
Can you talk about Leveson?
Leveson, well, I mean,
and the future.
It's not my area of policy. We have signed up to a process that we have said should be put into place, and I assume that's what we'll continue to do. Beyond that, I mean, you've got much more expertise in this area than I do. So.
I just wonder, because it's a very difficult situation.
It is.
It
is.
Because the game has changed since the parliamentary vote.
Yeah. To be honest, I don't know enough about it to know beyond that. Yeah.
John, question. As a northerner and hypocrite based in Cambridge, how does the Labour Party view... We're not one country now, we're several countries, and the north of England is incredibly deprived. I mean, there are pockets of development like Manchester, where I come from. But where is your regional policy? I mean, how are we going to avoid this situation where, more and more concentrations in the south? How do you reverse this? Take the case of France. I mean, France, it seems to be a centralised country. Mm-hmm. But at least outside Paris, their cities like Grenoble or Strasbourg or Toulouse or wherever seem to hold their own. Mm-hmm. What are we going to do about this?
I think the main thing is to recognise, there's two things. One is we don't talk the language of north-south divide, because there is there's been saying this for 30 years, but I mean, the truth is, if all that existed in England was southeast of the Seven-Way Line, there is still a case for socialism. Because our inequalities are greater, and you know, we look at the Cambridge stats earlier, you know, a higher percentage of people live in fuel poverty in Cambridge than do in Sheffield or Leeds. 13% of people don't get in this city, which has slightly above average incomes, don't get a living wage. Incomes here are slightly above the national average, but house prices are way above the national average. So the ratio between average income here and the chance of buying a house is far worse. So the first thing we've got to say is we mustn't get away from allow the idea, which is often there in the Labour movement, say the South's all fine, the problem's the North. Right. Secondly, though, the issues are different. And I think the overwhelming consensus now is that the drivers for regional economic growth are going to be the organic city regions that have been developing in recent years, rather than the imposed regional structures which we tried in the North East and the regional assemblies and all the rest of it, which didn't really quite. The RDAs worked. The interesting thing is the RDAs worked where the regions were viable, but they didn't work where they weren't. So one North East was very, very popular, as was the West Midlands one. The South West Development Agency was really popular for what it did on aerospace, but not for what it did on tourism, which people felt was better done by Cornwall or Devon or whatever. So the reality is that it doesn't work for everywhere, but the great drivers are likely to be the city regions around Liverpool, around Manchester, around Leeds, around Newcastle, in southern England, around the Hampshire, Southampton nexus, which actually would be the fifth biggest city region in the country when you put it together. And I think this ties together the economic development powers, the crucial role of higher education, of skills development, and the public service spending. So that's what the answer has got to be, I think. So I think it will not be a centralised structure for determining regional development, so much more as a much more genuine empowerment of the growing structures that are already out there. And there's been a huge change over the last 15 years.
Are you including local taxation?
Well, I think that the question came up earlier, and my view is it's not on the agenda now, but I'd be surprised if it isn't in 15 years' time if we go down this route. You know, Boris Johnson's already put it on the agenda for London. There's a sort of alliance between London and Manchester, where just before the last election, last thing I did was sign off the legal structure that brings 9 Manchester-related authorities together with additional powers. It's not quite London, but it's a bit more than Birmingham's got, sort of thing. So that's where it will come from, I think. And I think it's got to be a much more coherent, say, bringing together of the drivers of innovation and development, like the universities in those areas, with the local government structures and the business structures. And what we've got to get used to is it won't be neat. It will be quite messy.
But how the French got it together? I think they got it together. If you take French city regions like Toulouse, Strasbourg, Lyon, this is a strong. I don't know what it is.
Well, it's a bit odd, isn't it? Because on the one hand, the central government representatives are very powerful.
Yes.
But on the other hand, so are the mayors come up with. So I haven't studied it enough in detail. I think the lesson we learned in England was that designing something in Whitehall, and we tried it quite a bit in government, we tried to regionalise fire services and regionalise probation services. It's a very Treasury model. The Treasury worked out they thought it would be cheaper. And you tried to impose regions on regions that didn't exist for people. It didn't work. The best chance the city regions have got is that most people in those regions identify with them. Now, it will leave us with problems. You know, what's the city region in East Anglia, for example? You know, so we'll have to find Cambridge. Fine, that's that question. So we'll have to find answers to that. But that's where the drive will come from, and that's where, if you like, the leadership already exists. You know, most of these places, the vice chancellors, the council leaders, the key business leaders, the key people in the health service already know each other, and they are often actually building the networks they need at the moment without being told to do so by Whitehall.
Yeah.
So it's quite exciting, I think.
Well,
if a bit messy.
Certainly strength in Manchester.
Yeah.
Universities and Bernstein and all the rest.
And you know, Manchester has shown much more success in dealing with troubled families, much more success in getting long-term sick people back into work than any of the centralised programmes run by the DWP. Yeah.
Just two things. On the tax issue, I would actually be very, very careful of going down the local tax route, because this country has so many areas that are deprived, in the north for example, so that if the north is going to have to raise its own taxes in order to deliver its services, it really will be a recreation of an intensification of the divide between, for example, London and the other big centres in the north. But that's not really the issue I wanted to address. I wanted to address this issue about youth unemployment.
Yeah.
You see, if we start saying what we think is that youth should get a job after a year, of course we're going to get a negative response from people who don't think that's the right route to go down. But if we say, government, and when we're in government, we will take on the responsibility of ensuring that every young person has a decent job, decent work after a year, then I think the perspective is different. And we've already committed to building a certain number of houses within the first year that we're in government. And therefore we can link that. It's a creation of jobs by building houses, and then there's a multiplier effect. Once people are building houses, they have to go down to the local delicatessen and get a sandwich at lunch, etc. They have to get the cement from somewhere, they have to get the bricks to build the houses. So I think it's not just a question of language, but it's a question of what's going on in our heads. And as I said, if we say young people have to get a job after 12 months on benefits, there will be a negative response. If we say we, when we're in government, have a responsibility to ensure that young people can get a job, that's a very different thing. And as I said, it's not just about language, it's about the perspective, it's about what's going on in our heads and whether we're retributive against people who are not getting a job because there's not a job there, or if we are a government that sees that we have to create jobs for young people.
Well, I think that I'll disagree with that, because I mean you're quite right about all the ways in which you want to create jobs, but the reaction to the policy was almost entirely from people within the Labour Party.
Yes,
in the public as a whole, it is seen as a very good idea, because the public's view as a whole of Labour is that we are quite prepared to do very little and leave people living on welfare for a very long time. That is the perception that we're up against. Equally, from any rational assessment, leaving people to be unemployed for a very long period of time is not good for them. Thirdly, many of the people we're talking about are not automatically going to pick up jobs in the new economy if it does expand. They didn't during the boom years under us, despite all the programs we put in place, and they certainly aren't doing that now. So actually, an essential complement of the stuff we do about house building to develop the economy and so on is to actually say we will have quite tough policy, quite hard policy here, and we will, because it's in their best interests, get people into work. And we do need to be able to say to people who regard Labour, it's not coincidence that the Tories call us the welfare party. They don't do it because they've decided to call us that. It's because when they go and talk out to focus groups about what do you think about the Labour Party, people say they're the welfare party. We are more strongly identified at the moment as the party that spends people's money on welfare than we are as the party of job creation amongst the voters at large. So if you actually want to get through to that next set of voters to actually convince, you've actually got to have policies. We would never compete in a race to the bottom for harshness and toughness around social security, about welfare. That's not what we're for as a party. But actually, where there are things that we probably genuinely do believe in, that it would be better, because we did this in government. I mean, we had the Future Jobs Fund, okay? And we said after 6 months you actually had to take a job or a training place. Phenomenally successful. It prevented any rise in long-term youth unemployment in the years after the banking crash. Okay? So we've done it before in government. The tragedy of our position is not that these policies don't work and not that they're not a good thing, is that we're far too embarrassed to tell the general British public about them. And actually, pardon?
Why?
Because there's a funny thing about the psychology of the left. That there's a bit of the left that doesn't like saying we should do things like saying if you've been out of work for a period of time you should take a job. I mean it's actually something that our voters are entirely happy and relaxed about. but there's something about a culture in the Labour Party of people not being willing to do these things because they think it's blaming people for being unemployed. It's not blaming people for being unemployed. It's a sensible social policy. So it's about the psychology of it's slightly about the psychology of the Labour Party, I think, which is one of those areas where the public suspect that our values are not in tune with theirs.
Well, this kind of actually ties into your answer. So you talked about these three strands of
Yeah.
thinking. What I was kind of wondering was kind of two questions. One is, how does that tie into, or how do you envisage that tying into kind of a statement of values?
Okay.
And secondly, how do you kind of see that tying into messaging? Because kind of my kind of anecdotal observation that goes alongside this is I reckon that actually quite often the right are far, far better at talking in terms of values and coming up with very nice, clear messages than we are on the left. I mean, a classic example, I think, is how much it irritates me is Labour's mess. I think it's a really clear message that's been hammered home with kind of relentless enthusiasm, and I think it also comes with that kind of value, and we think of people like, oh, we know people who can't clear up after other people who haven't done good things. And I just kind of wondered how you saw that kind of, not abstract, but relatively abstract sort of strains of thought come together in terms of values and actually messages that we can bring to the electorate.
Yeah. I think the things that are strongest at the moment are, and which resonate most strongly, are that this government is widely seen as out of touch, is widely seen as serving the interests of a narrow section of the population, and it is widely seen as pessimistic about the future and what the future can deliver. Now, I think our challenge is to continue to say those things with strength, but then to build in that sense, which Ed started to do in his conference speech last year, to be fair, which is saying Britain deserves better than this, that actually there is a better future that is achievable. And you could say that one of our biggest political challenges at the moment is to find the right, and I'm not sure I've got the answers, to find the right way of injecting the optimism into a very pessimistic world. See, the parties of the left are much more likely to win when people out there have an optimistic view of how the future could be, and they see this government standing in their way of getting there. And one of our big challenges is there's very little optimism out there. So at the moment, a chunk of people who entirely agree with our criticism of what's wrong with the government, nonetheless are not sure that anybody could be different. And it's not because they think we're bad people, incidentally, or we've got the wrong policy. It's they're not sure the world can be different. So they're not waiting to hear a policy on X or a policy on Y and say, I'm now going to go and vote for these people. It's a deeper sort of pessimism about the ability of the world to be different. And I suppose I'm sort of slightly avoiding your question because I don't have the answer. Our values-based thing starts from the idea that things could be different and Britain could be doing better than this. But we need to do more than we've done at the moment.
Yeah, go on.
Oh, thanks. Just quickly. You talk about Labour's quick recovery from its terrible defeat in 2010, which is right. But of course, it means that there are lots of people who are now thinking about voting Labour who didn't do so quite recently, which seems to me to cause a potential problem for the party, that the Conservatives are going to run very heavily on the things that people didn't like about Labour in 2010 that stopped them voting for it then, in the hope that that will persuade them to make the same judgment in 2015. So how does the party kind of balance the things that it did right in government and that it wants to talk up, and you flagged up a few of them in your answers, with the things that are either rightly or wrongly electoral liabilities from that period?
Well, I think we have to talk about the future. So there's a debate that often comes up, because, I touched on it in my opening remarks. We did not have an economic policy. We didn't have a banking crisis because we had too many doctors and nurses. This idea that we ran Britain into the ground with irresponsible levels of public spending and that we caused the banking crisis are all obviously factuously wrong. There's not much mileage in spending all of our time having that argument, because you can only have one or two conversations with people at any one time. And so despite the fact that I mean, in fact, the Tories would love us to spend most of our time debating the causes of the banking crisis, because it only reminds people that that happened under a Labour government. So absolutely what we need to do, I mean, we do this on the doorstep, so if people ask the question, we need to know the answers, so we all, as we did at the school this afternoon, when somebody asked the explicit question, you need to know the answer to it as why it wasn't all our fault. But our communications messages have got to be forward-looking and optimistic about dealing with things of where people are now. And we almost need to take advantage of the fact that most people are not highly politicised and not highly partisan. Most people generally think that governments let them down. Right? Because we're in the Labour Party, we like to think that everyone thinks the government makes people better. Most people out there think government's a bonus if it hasn't actively made their life worse. So people have fairly low expectations of what governments can do. So in that sense, even if people associate us rightly or wrong, some of the things we did get wrong, and other things we didn't get wrong that we got blamed for, even if people associate us with things they didn't like, they are still most interested to know what we would do next. Okay? So actually, we must be careful not to overstate the effect of that Tory attack. That Tory attack will work if it looks as though we've got nothing to offer and we're just relying on the unpopularity of the current government. Provided we have an optimism and a confidence about what we're going to do, then we can head it off. Yep.
So someone mentioned France earlier. I want to ask you a question about so the research you did for the Fabian book and picking out the strands of Ed Miliband's thinking. I wonder if anything was picked up about kind of his relationship to kind of European socialism and social democracy, because he was a very ardent supporter of Hollande. And when Hollande won, he was saying this is a victory kind of like my kind of thing.
Yeah.
But I mean, Hollande's style of government up until now has kind of struck me as sort of atavistic in its dirigisme, and his general policy doesn't seem to me to kind of be as forward-looking as Ed Miliband's thinking indeed is. So I'd be interested to know what his thinking is, what you think his thinking is on relationship to kind of Scandinavian social democracy and kind of European or world movements of the left, and how the Labour Party might relate to that. Yeah,
I mean, there's not much in the book actually about that. There's a nice piece by David Clark, who used to be Robin Cook's special advisor, which broadly summarised by saying Ed hasn't said very much about Europe, but if he did, it might look like this. So it was one of the thinner chapters in the book that came out a couple of years ago. And clearly what Ed reacted to with Hollande's election victory was the possibility of winning on the left in the circumstances following the banking crisis. Now, I don't think you should read too much more into it than that. Ed is clearly a committed European, has no trouble with Euroscepticism, understands the need to sort of build the alliances that enable us to reform Europe in the way that it needs to be reformed. A lot, in my view, I've not talked to him about it, a lot in my view about the Labour Party's current language around Europe understands that this is almost an intensely tactical debate at the moment in relation to the Tories and to UKIP. There was the option, which a number of people urged on Ed, 18 months ago now, to make an early call for a referendum. He rejected that on what turned out to be a very consistent view that firstly it doesn't do parties that recommend it any good, and it hasn't done the Tories any good, but certainly it's the level of uncertainty that introduces is inimical to the sort of economic growth that we want to see. Whether that remains absolutely the same position over the next few years, we'll have to see. I mean, most of us can contemplate the possibility of a referendum, and we would need to have one if there was significant treaty change, in my view. But at the moment, this is a debate where what would we say? I would guess the priority is on defending the space to be a pro-European party in a hostile political environment. Yeah.
John, I think your original title, I can't remember exactly, was something to do with the left.
That was a title that was suggested, but I think that I
Can
tried to explain at the beginning
that
why.
was spat out. I mean, do you see the party? What does the left mean in the Labour Party?
Well, and so the reason I decided not to talk, the title was suggested to me and I rejected it, was precisely because you had to spend 40 minutes trying to define what being on the left is.
Okay.
And this woman I said that I saw being interviewed the other day thought that sorting out the banks wasn't being left-wing, getting private companies out of the health service wasn't left-wing, but telling people they couldn't smoke in their cars was left-wing. So out there almost as a meaningless framework for people. What did John Prescott used to say? Historic values, modern setting, or something of that sort. I mean, it seems to me that the left in practice has always been about finding ways of challenging or shaping markets to deliver for the public and social good.
Yes.
And it seems to me that that is exactly the enterprise that Ed Miliband is engaged in and is choosing.
Which is a major change from Blairism.
Which is a major change from Blairism and indeed Brownism. Because
Yeah.
Gordon was even more explicit than Tony, that you had a free market liberal economy and then you took the tax gains of that and redistributed it for public self and tax credits. Ed doesn't reject doing those things, but does not believe that those mechanisms can deliver the sort of economy that we want. That unless the economy itself delivers more for people at work, you can't do it by reason. Because at the end of the day, the people you're redistributing to keep meeting up with the people you're redistributing from. We ended up, and you saw this in the 2010 election, in a constituency like mine, where we had the 10th highest concentration of the key group of swing voters, which is why my majority was so small. There was like a £2,000 or £3,000 difference between the incomes of families who were paying into tax to distribute it to people who were only on £2,000 or £3,000 a year less. It just gets into an impossible situation. So you have to reshape the economy in that sort of way, and it's a hugely challenging task. But I think we've set off in the right direction.
I think we've got time for just one more question, and
Yeah.
I think we'll have to
Okay.
room soon. So there we go. Yeah.
People's perceptions of management of the economy is obviously key
Yeah.
to winning elections, and always has been. And given the argument about screwing up the economy
Yeah.
was largely lost, and the argument can be made that the Tory government have also screwed up the economy for the last 3 years.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, taking your point about looking to the future, we've got to be able to paint a picture of how the economy will be better run by a Labour government. And you've done that in a very broad brush way,
Yeah.
which leaves me still unclear what it would actually mean in practice. How in practice would we create the growth that is always put forward as the solution to a lot of the difficult economic problems that we're going to face, and how, and if we can achieve growth, how can we do that in a real way rather than allowing the financial sector to stoke up again, which is what's currently happening, or indeed the housing market stoke up in a way that's beginning to happen. How can we get a real sustainable policies that will generate growth, and in particular, if we get an increase in GDP, how do we, for the last 2 decades at least, increases in GDP have actually only benefited a small proportion of the population. The top 1% have got fabulously rich, and the bottom 50% have got poorer and poorer. So there's a huge challenge there, and I don't see how an easy solution to how you put that right.
No, if you want an easy solution, I think you won't find one. I think what you can do, though, is you can look to a number of different elements that come into it. So one is a set of institutional or regulatory reforms. So tackling the short-termism in investment, so that regulatory environment encourages long-term investment, breaking up anti-competitive cartels, as we've talked about in energy and elsewhere, encouraging markets to be more disruptive so that new entrants can come in, so stuff like that. There's creating long-term certainty in the economy, which is probably the single most important thing for business investment. So the Armit report was published, which nobody took any notice of. It is about recognising that infrastructure projects last more than a parliament. And so you actually have to have mechanisms in government and in parliament for deciding on the infrastructure needs we have in the country, because we don't have the French tradition of saying there's going to be a train from Paris to Marseille, and if you're in the way, bad luck. You know, we don't have that system, but you need to actually be able... We never build anything in this country. We never resolve an airport policy, a wind turbine policy, a nuclear power, but we never build anything because we can't agree and stick to it. So actually transforming infrastructure investment is critically important. Bringing in confidence and certainty in sectoral policy in the economy. I mean, one of the things that frustrates me we don't talk about more, we laid the foundations for today's success of the motor industry. Post the banking crisis, when we set up the Automotive Council, and Peter Mandelson and I invested about £2 billion in the motor industry, and brought the motor industry together, who agreed on 5 or 6 key technologies that were essential to the success of the British motor industry. So companies that were competing in the marketplace were collaborating with universities on key technologies, is what has led to the foreign investment into JLR and other places that have led to the success of the motor industry. So we can do that in other... Motor industry is not the same as creative industries or IT or whatever. You can do the same. So you have confidence in particular sectoral areas. And we have to then look... I mean, the last area I mentioned, though, there's clearly financial institution reform, banking reform, regional banking, recreating the ability to have a financial sector that can support business, and crucial areas in the areas of skills and education, and still unresolved problems about the relationship between higher education and business and employment. So I'm afraid it's a palette with many colours on it. But I think if I could summarise it, and we were talking about this earlier, the single question is, if you put all of this together, does it make you as a business investor more likely to have confidence investing in this country or not? If we applied that test to everything we did, we wouldn't go far wrong. Because the Labour Party is not going to be the party that will promise to have lower taxes for the richest people. So if you're going to offer something to business, the offer to business is no, it's being a bloody good place to invest and build a business. So I would, if I was talking about it and not wanted to go this whole list of things we have to do, I'd say let's have a central test in government for everything we do that relates to business policy, which is, does it make you more likely to invest in Britain for the long term, not the short term, does it make you more likely to invest in Britain for the long term or not? If it does, we'll do it. And possibly if we said that consistently for the next year, which was the earlier discussion over dinner, we would be making a convincing case.
That's the issue is, if there is this long-term guarantee of investment environment, it's not the British necessarily who are going to invest. It means it's EDF from France and UK,
but that's
Chinese.
True, but we start from where we are. I mean, look, let me tell you a depressing story. One of the things we did almost by accident was we created a whole new British industry, because for environmental reasons we said that by 2017 every new home would have to be zero carbon. This generated an entire new British industry, because that required new types of architects, new types of building technology, new types of offset systems, new types of heat exchangers, and the investment came because the house building industry knew they had to meet this target through 2017. It involved virtually no public money. It was simply a regulatory target that people had to meet. And the new government came in and abandoned it. The industry stalled, and then the Vice Premier of China came here and bought the lot and took it back to China. £100 million, bought it from BRE, took the technology back to China, where it is now being developed. Now, our problem is, see, we actually know how to do it. We've done these things in government, and David Sainsbury's written a rather good book about this recently, which is well worth a read. David Sainsbury, who was the brilliant science minister who set up the Technology Strategy Board, which is another successful interventionist institution set up by Labour, which is now continued. So we do sort of know how to do it. We just need to pull it together into a story.
Right. Well,
Okay?
yeah, I think we're ahead of, but thank you very much for that. That was